Hello friends, welcome aboard the Sleepy Fairy Tale Express. I'm the Red Mermaid. This train is a dream journey to fairy tale land. Have you all got your train tickets? Subscribe and hit the like button to always be able to ride. Close your eyes, prick up your ears, and listen in a comfortable position. Today's story is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Alice was growing increasingly bored sitting by the riverbank with her sister. She glanced at her sister's book a couple of times, but it had no pictures or conversations. Alice wondered to herself, what is the use of a book without pictures or conversations? So Alice began to consider making a daisy chain, as that might be entertaining. The weather was so hot that she felt sleepy and her thoughts were becoming hazy. Suddenly, a white rabbit with pink eyes darted by her. This was not so remarkable, nor did Alice think it very strange to hear the rabbit say, "Oh dear! Oh dear! I shall be late." Later, Alice thought it very curious, but at the time, it all seemed quite natural. However, when the rabbit actually took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket and looked at it, Alice jumped to her feet, for it occurred to her that she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat pocket or a watch to take out of it. Full of curiosity, she ran across the field after it and was just in time to see it pop down a large rabbit hole under the hedge. Alice went after it, never considering how in the world she was to get out again. The rabbit hole went straight on like a tunnel for some way, and then dipped suddenly down. Alice had not a moment to think about stopping herself before she found herself falling down what seemed to be a very deep well. Either the well was very deep, or she fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time to look about her and wonder what was going to happen next. First, she tried to look down and make out what she was coming to, but it was too dark to see anything. Then she looked at the sides of the well and noticed they were filled with cupboards and bookshelves. Here and there she saw maps and pictures hung upon pegs. She took down a jar from one of the shelves as she passed. It was labeled orange marmalade, but to her great disappointment, it was empty. She did not like to drop the jar for fear of killing somebody, so managed to put it into one of the cupboards as she fell past it. Well, thought Alice to herself, after such a fall as this, I shall think nothing of tumbling down the stairs. How brave they'll all think me at home. Why, I wouldn't say anything about it, even if I fell off the top of the house. Which was very likely true. Down, down, down. Would the fall never come to an end? I wonder how many miles I've fallen by this time, she said aloud. I must be getting somewhere near the center of the earth. Let me see, that would be 4,000 miles down, I think. Alice had learned several things of this sort in her lessons in the schoolroom, and though this was not a very good opportunity for showing off her knowledge, as there was no one to listen to her, it was still good practice to say it over. Yes, that's about the right distance. But then I wonder what latitude or longitude I've got to? Alice had no idea what latitude was, or longitude either, but thought they were nice grand words to say. Presently, she began again. I wonder if I shall fall right through the earth. How funny it'll seem to come out among the people that walk with their heads downward. The antipathies. I think she was rather glad there was no one listening this time, as it didn't sound at all the right word, but I shall have to ask them what the name of the country is, you know. Please, ma'am, is this New Zealand or Australia? And she tried to curtsy as she spoke. Fancy curtsying as you're falling through the air. Do you think you could manage it? And what an ignorant little girl she'll think me for asking. No, it'll never do to ask. Perhaps I shall see it written up somewhere. Down, down, down. There was nothing else to do, so Alice soon began talking again. Dinah'll miss me very much tonight, I should think. Dinah was the cat. I hope they'll remember her saucer of milk at tea time. Dinah, my dear, I wish you were down here with me. Alice felt that she was dozing off, and had just begun to dream that she was walking hand in hand with Dinah, and was saying to her, very earnestly, "Now, Dinah, tell me the truth. Did you ever eat a bat?" When suddenly, thump, thump, down she came upon a heap of sticks and dry leaves, and the fall was over. Alice was not a bit hurt, and jumped up to her feet in a moment. She looked up, but it was all dark overhead. Before her was another long passage, and the white rabbit was still in sight, hurrying down it. There was not a moment to be lost. Away went Alice like the wind, and she was just in time to hear it say, as it turned a corner, "All my ears and whiskers, how late it's getting." She was close behind it when she turned the corner, but the rabbit was no longer to be seen. She found herself in a long, low hall, which was lit up by a row of lamps hanging from the roof. There were doors all around the hall, but they were all locked, and when Alice had been all the way down one side and up the other, trying every door, she walked sadly down the middle, wondering how she was ever to get out again. Suddenly she came upon a little three-legged table, all made of solid glass. There was nothing on it except a tiny golden key, and Alice's first thought was that it might belong to one of the doors of the hall, but, alas! Either the locks were too large, or the key was too small, but at any rate, it would not open any of them. However, on the second time around, she came upon a low curtain she had not noticed before, and behind it was a little door about 15 inches high. She tried the little golden key in the lock, and to her great delight, it fitted. Alice opened the door and found that it led into a small passage, not much larger than a rat hole. She knelt down and looked along the passage into the loveliest garden you ever saw. How she longed to get out of that dark hall and wander about among those beds of bright flowers and those cool fountains, but she could not even get her head through the doorway, and even if my head would go through, thought poor Alice, it would be of very little use without my shoulders. Oh, how I wish I could shut up like a telescope. I think I could if I only know how to begin. For, you see, so many out-of-the-way things had happened lately that Alice had begun to think that very few things indeed were really impossible. There seemed to be no use in waiting by the little door, so she went back to the table, half hoping she might find another key on it, or at any rate a book of rules for shutting people up like telescopes. This time she found a little bottle on it, which certainly was not here before, said Alice, and round the neck of the bottle was a paper label, with the words "Drink Me" beautifully printed on it in large letters. It was all very well to say "Drink me," but the wise little Alice was not going to do that in a hurry. "No, I'll look first," she said, "and see whether it's marked poison or not," for she had read several nice little histories about children who had got burnt and eaten up by wild beasts and other unpleasant things, all because they would not remember the simple rules their friends had taught them, such as that a red-hot poker will burn you if you hold it too long, and that if you cut your finger very deeply with a knife, it usually bleeds, and she had never forgotten that, if you drink much from a bottle marked poison, it is almost certain to disagree with you, sooner or later. However, this bottle was not marked poison, so Alice ventured to taste it, and finding it very nice, it had, in fact, a sort of mixed flavor of cherry tart, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, toffee, and hot buttered toast. She very soon finished it off. "What a curious feeling," said Alice. "I must be shutting up like a telescope." And so it was indeed. She was now only 10 inches high, and her face brightened up at the thought that she was now the right size for going through the little door into that lovely garden. First, however, she waited for a few minutes to see if she was going to shrink any further. She felt a little nervous about this, for it might end, you know, said Alice to herself, in my going out altogether, like a candle. I wonder what I should be like then. And she tried to fancy what the flame of a candle is like after the candle is blown out, for she could not remember ever having seen such a thing. After a while, finding that nothing more happened, she decided on going into the garden at once, but, alas, for poor Alice! When she got to the door, she found she had forgotten the little golden key, and when she went back to the table for it, she found she could not possibly reach it. She could see it quite plainly through the glass, and she tried her best to climb up one of the legs of the table, but it was too slippery, and when she had tired herself out with trying, the poor little thing sat down and cried. "Come, there's no use in crying like that," said Alice to herself, rather sharply. "I advise you to leave off this minute." She generally gave herself very good advice, though she very seldom followed it, and sometimes she scolded herself so severely as to bring tears into her eyes, and once she remembered trying to box her own ears for having cheated herself in a game of croquet she was playing against herself, for this curious child was very fond of pretending to be two people. "But it's no use now," thought poor Alice, "to pretend to be two people. Why, there's hardly enough of me left to make one respectable person." Soon her eye fell on a little glass box that was lying under the table. She opened it and found in it a very small cake, on which the words "Eat me" were beautifully marked in currants. "Well, I'll eat it," said Alice, "and if it makes me grow larger, I can reach the key, and if it makes me grow smaller, I can creep under the door, so either way, I'll get into the garden, and I don't care which happens." She ate a little bit, and said anxiously to herself, "Which way? Which way?" holding her hand on the top of her head to feel which way it was growing, and she was quite surprised to find that she remained the same size. To be sure, this generally happens when one eats cake, but Alice had got so much into the way of expecting nothing but out-of-the-way things to happen, that it seemed quite dull and stupid for life to go on in the common way. So she set to work and very soon finished off the cake. "How strange it's all getting," Alice exclaimed. Alice was so surprised that she had forgotten how to speak properly. "It feels like I'm stretching out like the largest telescope in the world. Goodbye, feet." Alice looked down at her feet, which seemed to be almost out of sight. They were so far off. "Oh, my poor little feet. Who will put on your shoes and stockings for you now, dears? I'm sure I can't. You must manage the best you can, but I must be kind to them," thought Alice, "or perhaps they won't walk the way I want to go. Let me see, I'll give them a new pair of boots every Christmas." And she went on planning how she would manage it. "They must go by the carrier," she thought, "and how funny it'll seem, sending presents to one's own feet. And how odd the directions will look. To Alice's right foot, hearthrug, near the fender, with Alice's love, Dot. Oh dear, what nonsense I'm talking." Just then her head struck against the roof of the hall. In fact, she was now more than 9 feet high. She at once took up the little golden key and hurried off to the garden door. Poor Alice! It was as much as she could do, lying down on one side, to look through into the garden with one eye, but to get through was more hopeless than ever. She sat down and began to cry again. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," said Alice. "A great girl like you," she might well say this, "to go on crying in this way. Stop this moment, I tell you." But she went on all the same, shedding gallons of tears, until there was a large pool all around her, about 4 inches deep and reaching halfway down the hall. After a time, she heard a little pattering of feet in the distance, and she hastily dried her eyes to see what was coming. It was the White Rabbit returning, splendidly dressed, with a pair of white kid gloves in one hand and a large fan in the other. He came trotting along in a great hurry, muttering to himself as he came, "Oh, the Duchess, the Duchess! Oh, won't she be savage if I've kept her waiting?" Alice felt so desperate that she was ready to ask help of anyone, so, when the rabbit came near her, she began, in a timid voice, "If you please, sir." The rabbit started violently, dropped the white kid gloves and the fan, and scurried away into the darkness as hard as he could go. Alice took up the fan and gloves, and, as the hall was very hot, she kept fanning herself all the time she went on talking. "Dear, dear, how queer everything is today. And yesterday things went on just as usual. I wonder if I've been changed in the night? Let me think, Was I the same when I got up this morning? I almost think I can remember feeling a little different. But if I'm not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? Ah, that's the great puzzle. And she began thinking over all the children she knew that were of the same age as herself, to see if she could have been changed for any of them. I'm sure I'm not Ada, she said, for her hair goes in such long ringlets, and mine doesn't go in ringlets at all. And I'm sure I can't be Mabel, for I know all sorts of things, and she knows such a very little. Besides, she's she, and I'm I, and oh dear, how puzzling it all is. I'll try if I know all the things I used to know. Let me see, 4 times 5 is 12, and 4 times 6 is 13, and 4 times 7 is, oh dear. I shall never get to 20 at that rate. However, the multiplication table doesn't signify. Let's try geography. London is the capital of Paris, and Paris is the capital of Rome, and Rome, no, that's all wrong, I'm certain. I must have been changed for Mabel. I'll try and say how doth the little, and she crossed her hands on her lap as if she were saying lessons, and began to repeat it, but her voice sounded hoarse and strange, and the words did not come the same as they used to do. How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail, and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale? How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spread his claws, and welcome little fishes in, with gently smiling jaws. I'm sure those are not the right words, said poor Alice, and her eyes filled with tears again as she went on. I must be Mabel after all, and I shall have to go and live in that poky little house, and have next to no toys to play with, and oh, ever so many lessons to learn. No, I've made up my mind about it. If I'm Mabel, I'll stay down here. It'll be no use their putting their heads down and saying, "Come up again, dear." I shall only look up and say, "Who am I, then?" Tell me that first, and then, if I like being that person, I'll come up. If not, I'll stay down here till I'm somebody else. But, oh dear, cried Alice, with a sudden burst of tears, I do wish they would put their heads down. I am so very tired of being all alone here. As she said this, she looked down at her hands and was surprised to see that she had put on one of the rabbit's little white kid gloves while she was talking. How can I have done that? She thought. I must be growing small again. She got up and went to the table to measure herself by it and found that, as nearly as she could guess, she was now about 2 feet high and was going on shrinking rapidly. She soon guessed that the cause of this was the fan she was holding, and she dropped it hastily, just in time to avoid shrinking away altogether. That was a narrow escape, said Alice, a good deal frightened at the sudden change, but very glad to find herself still in existence. And now for the garden, and she ran with all speed back to the little door, but alas! The little door was shut again, and the little golden key was lying on the glass table as before. And things are worse than ever, thought the poor child, for I never was so small as this before, never. And I declare it's too bad, that it is." As she said these words, her foot slipped, and in another moment, splash! She was up to her chin in salt water. Her first idea was that she had somehow fallen into the sea, and in that case I can go back by railway, she said to herself. Alice had been to the seaside once in her life, and had come to the general conclusion that wherever you go to on the English coast, you find a number of bathing machines in the sea, some children digging in the sand with wooden spades, then a row of lodging houses, and behind them, a railway station. However, she soon made out that she was in the pool of tears which she had wept when she was 9 feet high. "I wish I hadn't cried so much," said Alice, as she swam about, trying to find her way out. "I shall be punished for it now, I suppose, by being drowned in my own tears. That will be a queer thing, to be sure. However, everything is queer today." Just then she heard something splashing about in the pool a little way off, and she swam nearer to make out what it was. At first, she thought it must be a walrus or hippopotamus, but then she remembered how small she was now, and she soon made out that it was only a mouse that had slipped in like herself. Would it be of any use now, thought Alice, to speak to this mouse? Everything is so out of the way down here that I should think very likely it can talk. At any rate, there's no harm in trying. So she began, "Oh mouse, do you know the way out of this pool? I am very tired of swimming about here, oh mouse." Alice thought this must be the right way of speaking to a mouse. She had never done such a thing before, but she remembered having seen in her brother's Latin grammar, a mouse, of a mouse, to a mouse, oh mouse. The mouse looked at her rather inquisitively, and seemed to wink with one of its little eyes, but it said nothing. "Perhaps it doesn't understand English," thought Alice. "I dare say it's a French mouse, come over with William the Conqueror." For, with all her knowledge of history, Alice had no very clear notion of how long ago anything had happened. So she began again, "Oh est ma chat," which was the first sentence in her French lesson book. The mouse gave a sudden leap out of the water and seemed to quiver all over with fright. "Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice hastily, afraid that she had hurt the poor animal's feelings. "I quite forgot you didn't like cats." "Not like cats?" cried the mouse, in a shrill, passionate voice. "Would you like cats if you were me?" "Well, perhaps not," said Alice in a soothing tone. "Don't be angry about it. And yet I wish I could show you our cat Dinah. I think you'd take a fancy to cats if you could only see her. She is such a dear, quiet thing," Alice went on, half to herself as she swam lazily about in the pool, "and she sits purring so nicely by the fire, licking her paws and washing her face, and she is such a nice soft thing to nurse, and she's such a capital one for catching mice." "Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice again, for this time the mouse was bristling all over, and she felt certain it must be really offended. "We won't talk about her any more if you'd rather not." "We indeed," cried the mouse, who was trembling down to the end of his tail. "As if I would talk on such a subject. Our family always hated cats, nasty, low, vulgar things. Don't let me hear the name again." "I won't indeed," said Alice, in a great hurry to change the subject of conversation. Are you fond of dogs?" The mouse did not answer, so Alice went on eagerly. "There is such a nice little dog near our house I should like to show you. A little bright-eyed terrier, you know, with such long curly brown hair. And it'll fetch things when you throw them, and it'll sit up and beg for its dinner, and all sorts of things. I can't remember half of them, and it belongs to a farmer, you know, and he says it's so useful, it's worth £100. He says it kills all the rats, and oh dear," cried Alice in a sorrowful tone, "I'm afraid I've offended it again." For the mouse was swimming away from her as hard as it could go, and making quite a commotion in the pool as it went. So she called softly after it, "Mouse dear, do come back again, and we won't talk about cats or dogs either, if you don't like them." When the mouse heard this, it turned round and swam slowly back to her. Its face was quite pale with passion, Alice thought, and it said in a low trembling voice, "Let us get to the shore, and then I'll tell you my history, and you'll understand why it is I hate cats and dogs." It was high time to go, for the pool was getting quite crowded with the birds and animals that had fallen into it. There was a duck and a dodo, a lory and an eaglet, and several other curious creatures. Alice led the way, and the whole party swam to the shore. The sight of the animals coming out of the water was quite a spectacle. The birds had their feathers sticking to them, and the other animals were soaked to the skin and dripping water as they came ashore, all looking very grumpy and disheveled. The question of how to get dry was now the most important thing to discuss. They began to confer about it, and after a while, Alice felt it was perfectly natural to be talking with animals as if she had known them all her life. In fact, she had a long argument with a parrot, who finally sulked and said, "I'm older than you, so I must know better." To which Alice would not agree without knowing how old the parrot was, and since the parrot wouldn't tell its age, the argument was over. Finally, the mouse, who seemed to be a person of some authority among them, called out, "Sit down, all of you, and listen to me. I'll soon make you dry enough." They all sat down at once, in a large ring, with the mouse in the middle. Alice looked around, shivering with cold, as she was afraid she might catch a cold if she didn't dry off soon. "Ahem," said the mouse with an air of importance. "Are you all ready? This is the driest thing I know. Silence all round, please." William the Conqueror, whose cause was favored by the Pope, was soon submitted to by the English, who wanted leaders and had been of late much accustomed to usurpation and conquest. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria. "Ugh," said the parrot, shivering. "I beg your pardon?" said the mouse, frowning, but very politely, "Did you speak?" "Not I," said the parrot hastily. "I thought you did," said the mouse. "I proceed. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, declared for him, and even Stigand, the patriotic Archbishop of Canterbury, found it advisable." "Found what?" said the duck. "Found it," the mouse replied rather crossly. "Of course, you know what it means." "I know what it means well enough when I find a thing," said the duck. "It's generally a frog or a worm. The question is, what did the Archbishop find?" The mouse did not notice this question but hurriedly went on. "Found it advisable to go with Edgar Atheling to meet William and offer him the crown. William's conduct at first was moderate. But the insolence of his Normans— How are you getting on now, my dear?" it continued, turning to Alice as it spoke. "As wet as ever," said Alice in a melancholy tone. "It doesn't seem to dry me at all." "In that case," said the dodo solemnly, rising to its feet, "I move that the meeting adjourn, for the immediate adoption of more energetic remedies." "Speak English," said the eaglet. "I don't know the meaning of half those long words, and what's more, I don't believe you do either." And the eaglet bent down its head to hide a smile. Some of the other birds tittered audibly. "What I was going to say," said the dodo in an offended tone, "was that the best thing to get us dry would be a caucus race." "What is a caucus race?" said Alice, not that she wanted much to know, but the dodo had paused as if it thought that somebody ought to speak, and no one else seemed inclined to say anything. "Why," said the dodo, "the best way to explain it is to do it. And as you might like to try the thing yourself, some winter day, I will tell you how the dodo managed it." First, it marked out a race course, in a sort of circle. "The exact shape doesn't matter," it said, and then all the party were placed along the course, here and there. There was no 1, 2, 3, and away, but they began running when they liked, and left off when they liked, so that it was not easy to know when the race was over. However, when they had been running half an hour or so and were quite dry again, the dodo suddenly called out, "The race is over," and they all crowded around it, panting and asking, "But who has won?" This question the dodo could not answer without a great deal of thought, and it stood for a long time with one finger pressed upon its forehead, the position in which you usually see Shakespeare in the pictures of him, while the rest waited in silence. At last, the dodo said, "Everybody has won, and all must have prizes." "But who is to give the prizes?" quite a chorus of voices asked. "Why, she, of course," said the dodo, pointing to Alice with one finger, and the whole party at once crowded round her, calling out in a confused way, "Prizes! Prizes!" Alice had no idea what to do, and in despair, she put her hand in her pocket and pulled out a box of comfits. Luckily the salt water had not got into it, and handed them round as prizes. There was exactly 1 apiece all round. "But she must have a prize herself, you know," said the mouse. "Of course," The dodo replied very gravely. "What else have you got in your pocket?" it went on, turning to Alice. "Only a thimble," said Alice sadly. "Hand it over here," said the dodo. Then they all crowded round her once more, while the dodo solemnly presented the thimble, saying, "We beg your acceptance of this elegant thimble," and, when it had finished this short speech, they all cheered. Alice thought the whole thing very absurd, but they all looked so grave that she did not dare to laugh, and, as she could not think of anything to say, she simply bowed and took the thimble, looking as solemn as she could. The next thing was to eat the comfits. This caused some noise and confusion, as the large birds complained that they could not taste theirs, and the small ones choked and had to be patted on the back. However, it was over at last, and they sat down again in a ring and begged the mouse to tell them something more. "You promised to tell me your history, you know," said Alice, "and why it is you hate C and D," she added in a whisper, half afraid that it would be offended again. "Mine is a long and a sad tale," said the mouse, turning to Alice and sighing. "It is a long tale, certainly," said Alice, looking down with wonder at the mouse's tail, "but why do you call it sad?" And she kept on puzzling about it while the mouse was speaking, so that her idea of the tale was something like this. Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, "Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you. Come, I'll take no denial. We must have a trial. For really this morning I've nothing to do," said the mouse to the cur, "such a trial, dear sir, with no jury or judge, would be wasting our breath. I'll be judge, I'll be jury," said cunning old Fury. "I'll try the whole cause and condemn you to death. You are not attending," said the mouse to Alice severely. "What are you thinking of?" "I beg your pardon," said Alice very humbly. "You had got to the fifth bend, I think? You insult me by talking such nonsense," said the mouse, getting up and walking away. "Please come back and finish your story," Alice called after it, and the others all joined in chorus, "Yes, please do," but the mouse only shook its head impatiently and walked a little quicker. "What a pity it wouldn't stay," sighed the lorry, as soon as it was quite out of sight, and an old crab took the opportunity of saying to her daughter, "Ah, my dear, let this be a lesson to you never to lose your temper." "Hold your tongue, Ma," said the young crab, a little snappishly. "You're enough to try the patience of an oyster." "I wish I had our Dinah here, I know I do," said Alice aloud, addressing nobody in particular. she'd soon fetch it back. "And who is Dinah, if I might venture to ask the question?" said the Lory. Alice replied eagerly, for she was always ready to talk about her pet. "Dinah's our cat. And she's such a capital one for catching mice, you can't think. And oh, I wish you could see her after the birds. Why, she'll eat a little bird as soon as look at it." This speech caused a remarkable sensation among the party. Some of the birds hurried off at once. One old magpie began wrapping itself up very carefully, remarking, "I really must be getting home. The night air doesn't suit my throat." And a canary called out in a trembling voice to its children, "Come away, my dears. It's high time you were all in bed." On various pretexts, they all moved off, and Alice was soon left alone. "I wish I hadn't mentioned Dinah," she said to herself in a melancholy tone. "Nobody seems to like her down here, and I'm sure she's the best cat in the world. Oh, my dear Dinah, I wonder if I shall ever see you any more." And here poor Alice began to cry again, for she felt very lonely and low-spirited. In a little while, however, she again heard a little pattering of footsteps in the distance, and she looked up eagerly, half hoping that the mouse had changed its mind and was coming back to finish its story. The footsteps were those of the White Rabbit returning slowly. The rabbit looked around anxiously, as if it had lost something, and was muttering to itself, "The Duchess! The Duchess! Oh, my dear paws! Oh, my fur and whiskers! She'll have me executed, as sure as ferrets are ferrets. Where can I have dropped them, I wonder?" Alice quickly realized that the rabbit was looking for the fan and the pair of white kid gloves. Being a kind-hearted girl, she began to look around for them too, but they were nowhere to be seen. Everything seemed to have changed after she fell into the pool of tears. The large hall, with the glass table and the little door, had vanished completely. The rabbit noticed Alice as she was looking around and called out to her in an angry voice, "Why, Marianne, what are you doing out here? Run home this moment and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan. Quick, now!" Alice was so frightened that she ran off at once in the direction it pointed to, without trying to explain the mistake it had made. "He took me for his housemaid," she said to herself as she ran. "How surprised he'll be when he finds out who I am. But I'd better take him his fan and gloves, that is, if I can find them." As she said this, she came upon a neat little house, on the door of which was a bright brass plate with the name W. Rabbit engraved upon it. She went in without knocking and hurried upstairs, in great fear lest she should meet the real Mary and be turned out of the house before she had found the fan and gloves. "How queer it seems," Alice said to herself, "to be going on errands for a rabbit. I suppose Dinah'll be sending me on errands next." And she began to fancy what she would say to Dinah. "Alice, come here directly, and get ready for your walk." "Coming in a minute, nurse. But I've got to watch this mouse hole till Dinah comes back, and see that the mouse doesn't get out. Only I don't think," Alice went on, "that they'd let Dinah stop in the house if it began ordering people about like that." By this time, she had found her way into a tidy little room with a table and a window, and on it, as she had hoped, a fan and 2 or 3 pairs of tiny white kid gloves. She took up the fan and a pair of the gloves and was just going to leave the room when her eye fell upon a little bottle that stood near the looking glass. There was no label this time with the words "Drink me," but nevertheless, she uncorked it and put it to her lips. "I know something interesting is sure to happen," she said to herself, "whenever I eat or drink anything, so I'll just see what this bottle does. I do hope it'll make me grow large again, for really I'm quite tired of being such a tiny little thing." It did so indeed, and much sooner than she had expected. Before she had drunk half the bottle, she found her head pressing against the ceiling, and had to stoop to save her neck from being broken. She hastily put down the bottle, saying to herself, "That's quite enough, I hope I shan't grow anymore. As it is, I can't get out at the door. I do wish I hadn't drunk quite so much." Alas! It was too late to wish that. She went on growing and growing, and very soon had to kneel down on the floor. In another minute there was not even room for this, and she tried the effect of lying down with one elbow against the door and the other arm curled round her head. Still, she went on growing, and, as a last resource, she put one arm out of the window and one foot up the chimney and said to herself, "Now I can do no more, whatever happens. What will become of me?" Luckily for Alice, the little magic bottle had now had its full effect, and she grew no larger. Still, it was very uncomfortable, and, as there seemed to be no sort of chance of her ever getting out of the room again, no wonder she felt unhappy. It was much pleasanter at home, thought poor Alice, when one wasn't always growing larger and smaller, and being ordered about by mice and rabbits. "I almost wish I hadn't gone down that rabbit hole, and yet, it's rather curious, you know, this sort of life. I do wonder what can have happened to me. When I used to read fairy tales, I fancied that kind of thing never happened, and now here I am in the middle of one. There ought to be a book written about me, that there ought. And when I grow up, I'll write one, but I'm grown up now," she added in a sorrowful tone. "At least there's no room to grow up anymore here. But then," thought Alice, "shall I never get any older than I am now? That'll be a comfort, one way, never to be an old woman, but then, always to have lessons to learn. Oh, I shouldn't like that. Oh, you foolish Alice," she answered herself. "How can you learn lessons in here? Why, there's hardly room for you, and no room at all for any lesson books." And so she went on, taking first one side and then the other, and making quite a conversation of it altogether. But after a few minutes, she heard a voice outside and stopped to listen. "Mary Ann, Mary Ann," said the voice, "fetch me my gloves this moment." Then came a little pattering of feet on the stairs. Alice knew it was the rabbit coming to look for her, and she trembled till she shook the house, quite forgetting that she was now about 1,000 times as large as the rabbit and had no reason to be afraid of it. Presently the rabbit came up to the door and tried to open it, but as the door opened inward and Alice's elbow was pressed hard against it, that attempt proved a failure. Alice heard it say to itself, "Then I'll go round and get in at the window." "That you won't," thought Alice, and, after waiting till she fancied she heard the rabbit just under the window, she suddenly spread out her hand and made a snatch in the air. She did not get hold of anything, but she heard a little shriek and a fall and a crash of broken glass, from which she concluded that it was just possible it had fallen into a cucumber frame or something of the sort. Next came an angry voice, the rabbit's, "Pat! Pat! Where are you?" And then a voice she had never heard before, "Sure then I'm here. Digging for apples, Your Honor." "Digging for apples, indeed," said the rabbit angrily. "Here. Come and help me out of this. Now tell me, Pat, what's that in the window?" "Sure, it's an arm, Your Honor." He pronounced it arum. "An arm, you goose. Whoever saw one that size? Why, it fills the whole window." "Sure, it does, Your Honor, but it's an arm for all that." "Well, it's got no business there. At any rate, go and take it away." There was a long silence after this, and Alice could only hear whispers now and then, such as, "Sure, I don't like it, Your Honor, at all, at all. Do as I tell you, you coward," and at last, she spread out her hand again and made another snatch in the air. This time there were two little shrieks and more sounds of broken glass. "If you don't take this arm away, you'll be pulled out by the chimney, I promise you." At this moment, she heard more confused sounds of voices, more pattering of feet, and suddenly a shrill voice from outside shouted, "Now, Bill, you go down the chimney." "Oh, so Bill's got to come down the chimney, has he?" said Alice to herself. "Why, they seem to put everything upon Bill. I wouldn't be in Bill's place for a good deal. This fireplace is narrow, to be sure, but I think I can kick a little." She drew her foot as far down the chimney as she could and waited till she heard a little animal, she couldn't guess what sort it was, scratching and scrambling about in the chimney close above her. Then, saying to herself, "This is Bill," she gave one sharp kick, and waited to see what would happen next. The first thing she heard was a general chorus of "There goes Bill," then the rabbit's voice alone, "Catch him, you by the hedge," then silence, and then another confusion of voices, "Hold up his head, Brandy now, don't choke him, how was it, old fellow? What happened to you? Tell us all about it." Last came a little feeble, squeaking voice, "That's Bill," thought Alice. "Well, I hardly know no more. Thank ye, I'm better now, but I'm a deal too flustered to tell you. All I know is, something comes at me like a jack-in-the-box, and up I goes like a skyrocket." "So you did, old fellow," said the others. "We must burn the house down," said the rabbit's voice, and Alice called out as loud as she could, "If you do, I'll set Dinah at you." There was a dead silence instantly, and Alice thought to herself, "I wonder what they will do next. If they had any sense, they'd take the roof off." After a minute or two, they began moving about again, and Alice heard the rabbit say, "A barrowful will do, to begin with." "A barrowful of what?" thought Alice, but she had not long to doubt, for the next moment, a shower of little pebbles came rattling in at the window, and some of them hit her in the face. "I'll put a stop to this," she said to herself, and shouted out, "You'd better not do that again," which produced another dead silence. Alice noticed with some surprise that the pebbles were all turning into little cakes as they lay on the floor, and a bright idea came into her head. "If I eat one of these cakes," she thought, "it's sure to make some change in my size, and as it can't possibly make me larger, it must make me smaller, I suppose." So she swallowed one of the cakes, and was delighted to find that she began shrinking directly. As soon as she was small enough to get through the door, she ran out of the house and found quite a crowd of little animals and birds waiting outside. The poor little lizard, Bill, was in the middle, being supported by 2 guinea pigs, who were giving it something out of a bottle. They all made a rush at Alice the moment she appeared, but she ran off as hard as she could and soon found herself safe in a thick wood. "The first thing I've got to do," said Alice to herself, as she wandered about in the wood, "is to grow to my right size again. And the second thing is to find my way into that lovely garden. I think that will be the best plan." It sounded like an excellent plan, no doubt, and very neatly and simply arranged. The only difficulty was that she had not the smallest idea how to set about it, and while she was peering about anxiously among the trees, a sharp bark just over her head made her look up in a great hurry. An enormous puppy was looking down at her with large round eyes and feebly stretching out one paw, trying to touch her. "Poor little thing," said Alice in a coaxing tone, and she tried hard to whistle to it, but she was terribly frightened all the time at the thought that it might be hungry, in which case it would be very likely to eat her up in spite of all her coaxing. Hardly knowing what she did, she picked up a little bit of stick and held it out to the puppy, whereupon the puppy jumped into the air off all its feet at once with a yelp of delight and rushed at the stick and made believe to worry it. Then Alice dodged behind a great thistle to keep herself from being run over, and the moment she appeared on the other side, the puppy made another rush at the stick and tumbled head over heels in its hurry to get hold of it. Then Alice, thinking it was very like having a game of play with a cart horse, and expecting every moment to be trampled under its feet, ran round the thistle again. Then the puppy began a series of short charges at the stick, running a very little way forward each time and a long way back, and barking hoarsely all the while, till at last it sat down a good way off, panting, with its tongue hanging out of its mouth, and its great eyes half shut. This seemed to Alice a good opportunity for making her escape, so she set off at once and ran till she was quite tired and out of breath, until the puppy's bark sounded quite faint in the distance. "And yet what a dear little puppy it was," said Alice, as she leaned against a buttercup to rest, and fanned herself with one of the leaves. "I should have liked teaching it tricks very much, if I'd only been the right size to do it. Oh dear! I'd nearly forgotten that I've got to grow up again. Let me see, how is it to be managed? I suppose I ought to eat or drink something or other, but the great question is, what?" The great question certainly was, what? Alice looked all around her at the flowers and the blades of grass, but she did not see anything that looked like the right thing to eat or drink under the circumstances. There was a large mushroom growing near her, about the same height as herself, and when she had looked under it and on both sides of it and behind it, it occurred to her that she might as well look and see what was on the top of it. She stretched herself up on tiptoe and peeped over the edge of the mushroom, and her eyes immediately met those of a large blue caterpillar that was sitting on the top with its arms folded, quietly smoking a long hookah and taking not the smallest notice of her or of anything else. Alice and the caterpillar looked at each other in silence. At last, the caterpillar took the hookah out of its mouth and addressed her in a languid, sleepy voice. "Who are you?" This was not an encouraging opening for a conversation. Alice replied, rather shyly, I hardly know, sir. Just at present, at least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then." "What do you mean by that?" said the caterpillar sternly. "Explain yourself." "I'm afraid I can't explain myself, sir," said Alice, "because I'm not myself, you see." "I don't see," said the caterpillar. "I'm afraid I can't put it more clearly," Alice replied very politely, "for I can't understand it myself to begin with, and being so many different sizes in a day is very confusing." "It isn't," said the caterpillar. "Well, perhaps you haven't found it so yet," said Alice, "but when you have to turn into a chrysalis, you will someday, you know, and then after that into a butterfly. I should think you'll feel it a little queer, won't you?" "Not a bit," said the caterpillar. "Well, perhaps your feelings may be different," said Alice. "All I know is, it would feel very queer to me." "You," said the caterpillar contemptuously. "Who are you?" Which brought them back again to the beginning of the conversation. Alice felt a little irritated at the caterpillars making such very short remarks, and she drew herself up and said very gravely, "I think you ought to tell me who you are, first." "Why?" said the caterpillar. Here was another puzzling question, and as Alice could not think of any good reason, and as the caterpillar seemed to be in a very unpleasant state of mind, she turned away. "Come back," the caterpillar called after her. "I've something important to say." This sounded promising, certainly. Alice turned and came back again. "Keep your temper," said the caterpillar. "Is that all?" said Alice, swallowing down her anger as well as she could. "No," said the caterpillar. Alice Alice thought she might as well wait, as she had nothing else to do, and perhaps after all, it might tell her something worth hearing. For some minutes it puffed away without speaking, but at last, it unfolded its arms, took the hookah out of its mouth again, and said, "So you think you're changed, do you?" "I'm afraid I am, sir," said Alice. "I can't remember things as I used, and I don't keep the same size for 10 minutes together." "Can't remember what things?" said the caterpillar. "Well, I've tried to say how doth the little busy bee, but it all came different." Alice replied in a very melancholy voice. "Repeat, you are old, Father William," said the caterpillar. Alice folded her hands and began. "You are old, Father William," the young man said. "And your hair has become very white. And yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think, at your age, it is right?" "In my youth," Father William replied to his son, "I feared it might injure the brain. But now that I'm perfectly sure I have none, why, I do it again and again." "You are old," said the youth, "as I mentioned before, and have grown most uncommonly fat. Yet you turned a back somersault in at the door. Pray, what is the reason of that?" "In my youth," said the sage, as he shook his grey locks, "I kept all my limbs very supple. By the use of this ointment, 1 shilling a box. Allow me to sell you a couple?" "You are old," said the youth, "and your jaws are too weak for anything tougher than suet. Yet you finished the goose, with the bones and the beak. Pray, how did you manage to do it?" "In my youth," said his father, "I took to the law, and argued each case with my wife. And the muscular strength, which it gave to my jaw, has lasted the rest of my life." "You are old," said the youth, "one would hardly suppose that your eye was as steady as ever. Yet you balanced an eel on the end of your nose. What made you so awfully clever?" "I have answered 3 questions, and that is enough," said his father. "Don't give yourself airs. Do you think I can listen all day to such stuff? Be off, or I'll kick you downstairs." "That is not said right," said the caterpillar. "Not quite right, I'm afraid," said Alice, timidly. "Some of the words have got altered." "It is wrong from beginning to end," said the caterpillar decidedly, and there was silence for some minutes. The caterpillar was the first to speak. "What size do you want to be?" it asked. "Oh, I'm not particular as to size," Alice hastily replied, "only one doesn't like changing so often, you know." "I don't know," said the caterpillar. Alice said nothing. She had never been so much contradicted in her life before, and she felt that she was losing her temper. "Are you content now?" said the caterpillar. "Well, I should like to be a little larger, sir, if you wouldn't mind," said Alice. 3 inches is such a wretched height to be." "It is a very good height indeed," said the caterpillar angrily, rearing itself upright as it spoke. It was exactly 3 inches high. "But I'm not used to it," pleaded poor Alice in a piteous tone. And she thought to herself, "I wish the creatures wouldn't be so easily offended." "You'll get used to it in time," said the caterpillar, and it put the hookah into its mouth and began smoking again. This time Alice waited patiently until it chose to speak again. In a few minutes, the caterpillar took the hookah out of its mouth and languidly said, "One side will make you grow taller, and the other side will make you grow shorter." "One side of what? The other side of what?" thought Alice to herself. "Of the mushroom," said the caterpillar, just as if she had asked it aloud, and in another moment, it was out of sight. Alice remained looking thoughtfully at the mushroom for a minute, trying to make out which were the 2 sides of it, and as it was perfectly round, she found this a very difficult question. However, at last, she stretched her arms around it as far as they would go, and broke off a bit of the edge with each hand. "And now which is which?" she said to herself, and nibbled a little of the right-hand bit to try the effect. The next moment she felt a violent blow underneath her chin. It had struck her foot. She was a good deal frightened by this very sudden change, but she felt that there was no time to be lost, as she was shrinking rapidly, so she set to work at once to eat some of the other bit. Her chin was pressed so closely against her foot that there was hardly room to open her mouth, but she did it at last, and managed to swallow a morsel of the left-hand bit. "Come, my head's free at last," said Alice in a tone of delight, which changed into alarm in another moment when she found that her shoulders were nowhere to be found. All she could see, when she looked down, was an immense length of neck, which seemed to rise like a stalk out of a sea of green leaves that lay far below her. "What can all that green stuff be?" said Alice. "And where have my shoulders got to? And oh, my poor hands, how is it I can't see you?" She was moving them about as she spoke, but no result seemed to follow, except a little shaking among the distant green leaves. As there seemed to be no chance of getting her hands up to her head, she tried to get her head down to them and was delighted to find that her neck would bend about easily in any direction, like a serpent. She had just succeeded in curving it down into a graceful zigzag and was going to dive in among the leaves, which she found to be nothing but the tops of the trees under which she had been wandering, when a sharp hiss made her draw back in a hurry. A large pigeon had flown into her face and was beating her violently with its wings. "Serpent!" screamed the pigeon. "I'm not a serpent," said Alice indignantly. "Let me alone. Serpent, I say again," repeated the pigeon, but in a more subdued tone, and added with a kind of sob, "I've tried every way, and nothing seems to suit them." "I haven't the least idea what you're talking about," said Alice. "I've tried the roots of trees, and I've tried banks, and I've tried hedges," the pigeon went on, without attending to her, "but those serpents, there's no pleasing them. Alice was more and more puzzled, but she thought there was no use in saying anything till the pigeon had finished. "As if it wasn't trouble enough hatching the eggs," said the pigeon, "but I must be on the lookout for serpents night and day. Why, I haven't had a wink of sleep these 3 weeks." "I'm very sorry you've been annoyed," said Alice, who was beginning to see its meaning. "And just as I'd taken the highest tree in the wood," continued the pigeon, raising its voice to a shriek, "and just as I was thinking I should be free of them at last, they must needs come wriggling down from the sky. Ugh, serpent! But I'm not a serpent, I tell you," said Alice. I'm a, well, what are you?" said the pigeon. "I can see you're trying to invent something." I'm a little girl," said Alice, rather doubtfully, as she remembered the number of changes she had gone through that day. "A likely story indeed," said the pigeon in a tone of the deepest contempt. "I've seen a good many little girls in my time, but never one with such a neck as that. No, no. You're a serpent, and there's no use denying it. I suppose you'll be telling me next that you never tasted an egg." "I have tasted eggs, certainly," said Alice, who was a very truthful child, "but little girls eat eggs quite as much as serpents do, you know." "I don't believe it," said the pigeon, "but if they do, why, then they're a kind of serpent, that's all I can say." This was such a new idea to Alice that she was quite silent for a minute or two, which gave the pigeon the opportunity of adding, "You're looking for eggs, I know that well enough, and what does it matter to me whether you're a little girl or a serpent?" "It matters a good deal to me," said Alice hastily, "but I'm not looking for eggs, as it happens, and if I was, I shouldn't want yours. I don't like them raw." "Well, be off, then," said the pigeon in a sulky tone, as it settled down again into its nest. Alice crouched down among the trees as well as she could, for her neck kept getting entangled among the branches, and every now and then she had to stop and untwist it. After a while, she remembered that she still held the pieces of mushroom in her hands, and she set to work very carefully, nibbling first at one and then at the other, and growing sometimes taller and sometimes shorter, until she had succeeded in bringing herself down to her usual height. It was so long since she had been anything near the right size that it felt quite strange at first, but she got used to it in a few minutes and began talking to herself as usual. "Come, there's half my plan done now. How puzzling all these changes are. I'm never sure what I'm going to be from one minute to another. However, I've got back to my right size. The next thing is to get into that beautiful garden. How is that to be done, I wonder?" As she said this, she suddenly came upon an open place, with a little house in it, about 4 feet high. "Whoever lives there," thought Alice, "it'll never do to come upon them this size. Why, I should frighten them out of their wits." So she began nibbling at the right-hand bit again and did not venture to go near the house till she had brought herself down to 9 inches high. Alice was contemplating what to do next when suddenly a footman dressed in livery came running out of the forest. He knocked loudly on the door. Alice thought it was a footman because of the livery, but actually, he looked more like a fish. Another footman, who looked like a frog, opened the door. Both were powdered and curled, and their hair was arranged in curls. Alice crept closer to listen to their conversation. The fish footman pulled out an envelope as large as himself and handed it over solemnly to the frog footman, saying, "For the Duchess." An invitation from the Queen to play croquet. The frog footman repeated in the same solemn tone, "From the Queen." An invitation for the Duchess to play croquet. Then they both bowed so low that their curls got entangled together. Alice burst out laughing at this, but she was afraid they might hear her, so she quickly retreated into the forest. When she peeked out again, the fish footman was gone, and the frog footman was sitting on the ground near the door, staring stupidly up at the sky. Alice went timidly up to the door and knocked. "There's no use in knocking," said the footman, "and that for 2 reasons. First, because I'm on the same side of the door as you are. Secondly, because they're making such a noise inside, no one could possibly hear you." Indeed, there was a most extraordinary noise going on inside, a constant howling and sneezing, and every now and then a great crash, as if a dish or kettle had been broken to pieces. "Please, then," said Alice, "how am I to get in?" "There might be some sense in your knocking," the footman went on without attending to her, "if we had the door between us. For instance, if you were inside, you might knock, and I could let you out, you know." He was looking up into the sky all the time he was speaking, and this Alice thought was very rude. "But perhaps he can't help it," she said to herself, "his eyes are so very nearly at the top of his head. But at any rate he might answer questions. How am I to get in?" she repeated aloud. "I shall sit here," the footman remarked, "till tomorrow." At this moment, the door of the house opened and a large plate came skimming out, straight at the footman's head. It just grazed his nose and broke to pieces against one of the trees behind him. Or next day, maybe, the footman continued in the same tone, exactly as if nothing had happened. "How am I to get in?" Alice asked again, in a louder tone. "Are you to get in at all?" said the footman. "That's the first question, you know." It was, no doubt, only Alice did not like to be told so. "It's really dreadful," she muttered to herself, "the way all the creatures argue. It's enough to drive one crazy." The footman seemed to think this a good opportunity for repeating his remark, with variations. "I shall sit here," he said, "on and off, for days and days." "But what am I to do?" said Alice. "Anything you like," said the footman, and began whistling. "Oh, there's no use in talking to him," said Alice desperately. "He's perfectly idiotic." And she opened the door and went in. The door led right into a large kitchen, which was full of smoke from one end to the other, the Duchess was sitting on a three-legged stool in the middle, nursing a baby. The cook was leaning over the fire, stirring a large cauldron which seemed to be full of soup. "There's certainly too much pepper in that soup," Alice said to herself, as well as she could for sneezing. There was certainly too much of it in the air. Even the Duchess sneezed occasionally, and as for the baby, it was sneezing and howling alternately without a moment's pause. The only things in the kitchen that did not sneeze were the cook and a large cat which was sitting on the hearth and grinning from ear to ear. "Please would you tell me," said Alice, a little timidly, for she was not quite sure whether it was good manners for her to speak first, "why your cat grins like that?" "It's a Cheshire cat," said the Duchess, "and that's why." "Pig." She said the last word with such sudden violence that Alice quite jumped, but she saw in another moment that it was addressed to the baby and not to her, so she took courage and went on again. "I didn't know that Cheshire cats always grinned. In fact, I didn't know that cats could grin." "They all can," said the Duchess, "and most of them do." "I don't know of any that do," Alice said very politely, feeling quite pleased to have got into a conversation. "You don't know much," said the Duchess, "and that's a fact." Alice did not at all like the tone of this remark and thought it would be as well to introduce some other subject of conversation. While she was trying to fix on one, the cook took the cauldron of soup off the fire and at once set to work throwing everything within her reach at the Duchess and the baby. The fire irons came first, then followed a shower of saucepans, plates, and dishes. The Duchess took no notice of them even when they hit her, and the baby was howling so much already that it was quite impossible to say whether the blows hurt it or not. "Oh, please mind what you're doing," cried Alice, jumping up and down in an agony of terror. "Oh, there goes his precious nose," as an unusually large saucepan flew close by it and very nearly carried it off. "If everybody minded their own business," the Duchess said in a hoarse growl, "the world would go round a deal faster than it does." "Which would not be an advantage," said Alice, who felt very glad to get an opportunity of showing off a little of her knowledge. "Just think of what work it would make with the day and night. You see, the Earth takes 24 hours to turn round on its axis." "Talking of axes," said the Duchess, "chop off her head." Alice glanced rather anxiously at the cook, to see if she meant to take the hint, but the cook was busily stirring the soup and seemed not to be listening. So she went on again, 24 hours, I think, or is it 12? Oh, don't bother me," said the Duchess, "I never could abide figures." And with that, she began nursing her child again, singing a sort of lullaby to it as she did so, and giving it a violent shake at the end of every line. "Speak roughly to your little boy, and beat him when he sneezes. He only does it to annoy, because he knows it teases. Wow! Wow! Wow!" While the Duchess sang the second verse of the song, she kept tossing the baby violently up and down, and the poor little thing howled so that Alice could hardly hear the words. I speak severely to my boy. I beat him when he sneezes, for he can thoroughly enjoy the pepper when he pleases. Wow! 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 Here. You may nurse it a bit, if you like, the Duchess said to Alice, flinging the baby at her as she spoke. I must go and get ready to play croquet with the Queen, and she hurried out of the room. The cook threw a frying pan after her as she went out, but it just missed her. Alice caught the baby with some difficulty, as it was a queer-shaped little creature, and held out its arms and legs in all directions, just like a starfish, thought Alice. The poor little thing was snorting like a steam engine when she caught it and kept doubling itself up and straightening itself out again, so that altogether, for the first minute or two, it was as much as she could do to hold it. As soon as she had made out the proper way of nursing it, which was to twist it up into a sort of knot and then keep tight hold of its right ear and left foot, so as to prevent its undoing itself, she carried it out into the open air. If I don't take this child away with me, thought Alice, they're sure to kill it in a day or two. Wouldn't it be murder to leave it behind? She said the last words out loud, and the little thing grunted in reply. It had left off sneezing by this time. Don't grunt, said Alice. That's not at all a proper way of expressing yourself. The baby grunted again, and Alice looked very anxiously into its face to see what was the matter with it. There could be no doubt that it had a very turned-up nose, much more like a snout than a real nose. Also, its eyes were getting extremely small for a baby. Altogether, Alice did not like the look of the thing at all. But perhaps it was only sobbing, she thought, and looked into its eyes again to see if there were any tears. No, there were no tears. If you're going to turn into a pig, my dear, said Alice, seriously, I'll have nothing more to do with you. Mind now. The poor little thing sobbed again, and they went on for some while in silence. Alice was just beginning to think to herself, now, what am I to do with this creature when I get it home, when it grunted again, so violently, that she looked down into its face in some alarm. This time there could be no mistake about it. It was neither more nor less than a pig, and she felt that it would be quite absurd for her to carry it any further. So she set the little creature down and felt quite relieved to see it trot away quietly into the wood. If it had grown up, she said to herself, it would have made a dreadfully ugly child, but it makes rather a handsome pig, I think. And she began thinking over other children she knew, who might do very well as pigs, and was just saying to herself, if one only knew the right way to change them, when she was a little startled by seeing the Cheshire Cat sitting on a bough of a tree a few yards off. The cat only grinned when it saw Alice. It looked good-natured, she thought. Still, it had very long claws and a great many teeth, so she felt that it ought to be treated with respect. Cheshire Puss, she began, rather timidly, as she did not at all know whether it would like the name. However, it only grinned a little wider. Come, it's pleased so far, thought Alice, and she went on. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? That depends a good deal on where you want to get to, said the cat. I don't much care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't matter which way you go, said the cat. So long as I get somewhere, Alice added as an explanation. Oh, you're sure to do that, said the cat, if you only walk long enough. Alice felt that this could not be denied, so she tried another question. What sort of people live about here? In that direction, the cat waved a paw round, lives a hatter, and in that direction, waving the other paw, lives a March hare. Visit either you like, they're both mad. But I don't want to go among mad people, Alice remarked. Oh, you can't help that, said the cat, we're all mad here. I'm mad. You're mad. How do you know I'm mad? Said Alice. You must be, said the cat, or you wouldn't have come here. Alice didn't think that proved it at all. However, she went on, and how do you know that you're mad? To begin with, said the cat, a dog's not mad. You grant that? I suppose so, said Alice. Well, then, the cat went on, you see, a dog growls when it's angry, and wags its tail when it's pleased. Now I growl when I'm pleased, and wag my tail when I'm angry. Therefore I'm mad. I call it purring, not growling, said Alice. Call it what you like, said the cat. Do you play croquet with the queen today? I should like it very much, said Alice, but I haven't been invited yet. You'll see me there, said the cat, and vanished. Alice was not much surprised at this. She was getting so used to queer things happening. While she was looking at the place where it had been, it suddenly appeared again. By the by, what became of the baby? Said the cat. I'd nearly forgotten to ask. It turned into a pig, Alice quietly said, just as if the cat had come back in a natural way. I thought it would, said the cat, and vanished again. Alice waited a little, half expecting to see it again, but it did not appear, and after a minute or two she walked on in the direction in which the March hare was said to live. I've seen hatters before, she said to herself. The March hare will be much the most interesting, and perhaps as this is May it won't be raving mad, at least not so mad as it was in March. As she said this, she looked up, and there was the cat again, sitting on a branch of a tree. Did you say pig or fig? Said the cat. I said pig, replied Alice, and I wish you wouldn't keep appearing and vanishing so suddenly, you make one quite giddy. All right, said the cat, and this time it vanished quite slowly, beginning with the end of the tail and ending with the grin, which remained some time after the rest of it had gone. Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin, thought Alice, but a grin without a cat. It's the most curious thing I ever saw in my life. She had not gone much farther before she came in sight of the house of the March hare. She thought it must be the right house, because the chimneys were shaped like ears, and the roof was thatched with fur. It was so large a house that she did not like to go nearer till she had nibbled some more of the left-hand bit of mushroom and raised herself to about 2 feet high. Even then she walked up towards it rather timidly, saying to herself, suppose it should be raving mad after all. I almost wish I'd gone to see the Hatter instead. Under a tree in front of the house was a table set out for tea, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having tea at it. A dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep, and the other two were using it as a cushion, resting their elbows on it and talking over its head. Very uncomfortable for the dormouse, thought Alice, only, as it's asleep, I suppose it doesn't mind. The table was a large one, but the three were all crowded together at one corner of it. No room. No room, they cried out when they saw Alice coming. There's plenty of room, said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in a large armchair at one end of the table. Have some wine, the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Alice looked all around the table, but there was nothing on it but tea. I don't see any wine, she remarked. There isn't any, said the March Hare. Then it wasn't very civil of you to offer it, said Alice angrily. It wasn't very civil of you to sit down without being invited, said the March Hare. I didn't know it was your table, said Alice. It's laid for a great many more than 3. Your hair wants cutting, said the Hatter. He had been looking at Alice for some time with great curiosity, and this was his first speech. You should learn not to make personal remarks, Alice said with some severity. It's very rude. The Hatter opened his eyes very wide on hearing this, but all he said was, why is a raven like a writing desk? Come, we shall have some fun now, thought Alice. I'm glad they've begun asking riddles. I believe I can guess that, she added aloud. Do you mean that you think you can find out the answer to it? Said the March Hare. Exactly so, said Alice. Then you should say what you mean, the March Hare went on. I do, Alice hastily replied. At least I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know. Not the same thing a bit, said the Hatter. Why, you might just as well say that I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see. You might just as well say, added the March Hare, that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like. You might just as well say, added the Dormouse, who seemed to be talking in his sleep, that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe. It is the same with you, said the Hatter, and here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a minute, while Alice thought over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks, which wasn't much. The Hatter was the first to break the silence. What day of the month is it? He said, turning to Alice. He had taken his watch out of his pocket and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then and holding it to his ear. Alice considered a little, and then said, the 4th. 2 days wrong, sighed the Hatter. I told you butter wouldn't suit the works, he added, looking angrily at the March Hare. It was the best butter, the March Hare meekly replied. Yes, but some crumbs must have got in as well, the Hatter grumbled. You shouldn't have put it in with the bread knife." The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily. Then he dipped it into his cup of tea and looked at it again, but he could think of nothing better to say than his first remark: "It was the best butter, you know." Alice had been looking over his shoulder with some curiosity. "What a funny watch," she remarked. "It tells the day of the month and doesn't tell what o'clock it is." "Why should it?" muttered the Hatter. "Does your watch tell you what year it is?" "Of course not," Alice replied very readily, "but that's because it stays the same year for such a long time together." "Which is just the case with mine," said the Hatter. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. The Hatter's remark seemed to her to have no sort of meaning in it, and yet it was certainly English. "I don't quite understand you," she said, as politely as she could. "The Dormouse is asleep again," said the Hatter, and he poured a little hot tea upon its nose. The Dormouse shook its head impatiently and said, without opening its eyes, of course, just what I was going to remark myself." "Have you guessed the riddle yet?" the Hatter said, turning to Alice again. "No, I give it up," Alice replied. "What's the answer?" "I haven't the slightest idea," said the Hatter. "Nor I," said the March Hare. Alice sighed wearily. "I think you might do something better with the time," she said, "than waste it in asking riddles that have no answers." "If you knew time as well as I do," said the Hatter, "you wouldn't talk about wasting it." "It's him." "I don't know what you mean," said Alice. "Of course, you don't," the Hatter said, tossing his head contemptuously. "I dare say you never even spoke to time." "Perhaps not," Alice cautiously replied, "but I know I have to beat time when I learn music." "Ah, that accounts for it," said the Hatter. "He won't stand beating. Now, if you only kept on good terms with him, he'd do almost anything you liked with the clock. For instance, suppose it were 9 o'clock in the morning, just time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint to time, and round goes the clock in a twinkling. 1:30, time for dinner." "I only wish it was," the March Hare said to itself in a whisper. "That would be grand, certainly," said Alice thoughtfully, "but then, I shouldn't be hungry for it, you know." "Not at first, perhaps," said the Hatter, "but you could keep it to 1:30 as long as you liked." "Is that the way you manage?" Alice asked. The Hatter shook his head mournfully. "Not I," he replied. "We quarreled last March, just before he went mad, you know," pointing with his teaspoon at the March Hare. "It was at the great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing, 'Twinkle, twinkle, little bat.' How I wonder what you're at. You know the song, perhaps?" "I've heard something like it," said Alice. "It goes on, you know," the Hatter continued, "in this way. Up above the world you fly, like a tea tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, Here the dormouse shook itself and began singing in its sleep, "Twinkle, twinkle, twinkle, twinkle," and went on so long that they had to pinch it to make it stop. "Well, I'd hardly finished the first verse," said the Hatter, when the Queen bawled out, "He's murdering the time. Off with his head." "How dreadfully savage!" exclaimed Alice. And ever since that, the Hatter went on in a mournful tone, "He won't do a thing I ask. It's always 6 o'clock now." A bright idea came into Alice's head. "Is that the reason so many tea things are put out here?" she asked. "Yes, that's it," said the Hatter with a sigh. "It's always tea time, and we've no time to wash the things between whiles." "Then you keep moving round, I suppose?" said Alice. "Exactly so," said the Hatter, "as the things get used up." "But what happens when you come to the beginning again?" Alice ventured to ask. "Suppose we change the subject," the March Hare interrupted, yawning. "I'm getting tired of this. I vote the young lady tells us a story." "I'm afraid I don't know one," said Alice, rather alarmed at the proposal. "Then the Dormouse shall," they both cried. "Wake up, Dormouse!" And they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened its eyes. "I wasn't asleep," it said in a hoarse, feeble voice. "I heard every word you fellows were saying." "Tell us a story," said the March Hare. "Yes, please do," pleaded Alice. "And be quick about it," added the Hatter, "or you'll be asleep again before it's done. Once upon a time there were 3 little sisters," the Dormouse began in a great hurry, "and their names were Elsie, Lacie, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well." "What did they live on?" said Alice, who always took a great interest in questions of eating and drinking. "They lived on treacle," said the Dormouse, after thinking a minute or two. "They couldn't have done that, you know," Alice gently remarked. "They'd have been ill." "So they were," said the Dormouse, "very ill." Alice tried to fancy to herself what such an extraordinary way of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much, so she went on, "But why did they live at the bottom of a well?" "Take some more tea," the March Hare said to Alice, very earnestly. "I've had nothing yet," Alice replied in an offended tone, "so I can't take more." "You mean you can't take less," said the Hatter. "It's very easy to take more than nothing." "Nobody asked your opinion," said Alice. "Who's making personal remarks now?" the Hatter asked triumphantly. Alice did not quite know what to say to this, so she helped herself to some tea and bread and butter, and then turned to the Dormouse and repeated her question. "Why did they live at the bottom of a well?" The Dormouse again took a minute or two to think about it, and then said, "It was a treacle well." "There's no such thing." Alice was beginning very angrily, but the Hatter and the March Hare went sh. "Sh," and the Dormouse sulkily remarked, "If you can't be civil, you'd better finish the story for yourself." "No, please go on," Alice said very humbly. "I won't interrupt again. I dare say there may be one." "One, indeed," said the Dormouse indignantly. However, he consented to go on. "And so these three little sisters, they were learning to draw, you know." "What did they draw?" said Alice, quite forgetting her promise. "Treacle," said the Dormouse, without considering at all this time. "I want a clean cup," interrupted the Hatter. "Let's all move one place on." He moved on as he spoke, and the Dormouse followed him. The March Hare moved into the Dormouse's place, and Alice rather unwillingly took the place of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who got any advantage from the change, and Alice was a good deal worse off than before, as the March Hare had just upset the milk jug into his plate. Alice did not wish to offend the Dormouse again, so she began very cautiously, "But I don't understand. Where did they draw the treacle from?" "You can draw water out of a water well," said the Hatter, "so I should think you could draw treacle out of a treacle well, stupid." "But they were in the well," Alice said to the Dormouse, not choosing to notice this last remark. "Of course they were," said the Dormouse. "Well, and..." This answer so confused poor Alice, that she let the Dormouse go on for some time without interrupting it. "They were learning to draw," the Dormouse went on, yawning and rubbing its eyes, for it was getting very sleepy, "and they drew all manner of things, everything that begins with an M." "Why with an M?" said Alice. "Why not?" said the March Hare. Alice was silent. The Dormouse had closed its eyes by this time and was going off into a doze, but, on being pinched by the Hatter, it woke up again with a little shriek, and went on, "That begins with an M, such as mousetraps, and the moon, and memory, and muchness. You know you say things are much of a muchness. Did you ever see such a thing as a drawing of a muchness?" "Really, now you ask me," said Alice, very much confused. "I don't think." "Then you shouldn't talk," said the Hatter. This piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She got up in great disgust, and walked off. The Dormouse fell asleep instantly, and neither of the others took the least notice of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping that they would call after her. The last time she saw them, they were trying to put the Dormouse into the teapot. "At any rate, I'll never go there again," said Alice as she picked her way through the wood. "It's the stupidest tea party I ever was at in all my life." Just as she said this, she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right into it. "That's very curious," she thought. "But everything's curious today. I think I may as well go in at once." And in she went. Once more she found herself in the long hall, and close to the little glass table. "Now, I'll manage better this time," she said to herself, and began by taking the little golden key, and unlocking the door that led into the garden. Then she went to work nibbling at the mushroom till she was about a foot high. Then she walked down the little passage, and then she found herself at last in a beautiful garden, among the bright flower beds and the cool fountains. At the entrance to the garden, there was a large rose tree. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners busily painting them red. Their actions were so strange that Alice went closer to watch them. She overheard one of the gardeners say, "Careful, 5. Don't splash paint on me." "I couldn't help it," 5 said in a sulky tone. 7 jogged my elbow. "That's right, 5. Always blame others," 7 retorted. "You're better off being quiet," 5 snapped back. "I heard the Queen say yesterday that you deserve to be beheaded." "Why?" asked the first gardener, 2. "That's none of your business," 7 responded. "Well, it's not 2's concern," 5 interjected. "But I'll tell you. It's because you brought tulip bulbs instead of onions to the cook." 7 threw down his brush and grumbled, "How unfair this is." Just then, 7 noticed Alice watching them and stopped talking. The other 2 gardeners also looked around and saw her, then immediately bowed to her. Alice, feeling curious, asked cautiously, "Why are you painting those roses?" 5 and 7 remained silent, looking at 2, who finally answered in a low voice, "Well, you see, miss, we were supposed to plant a red rose tree, but we accidentally planted a white one. If the Queen finds out, she'll have our heads. So, we're trying our best to fix it before she arrives." At this moment, 5, who had been nervously looking around, suddenly cried out, "The Queen! The Queen is coming!" The gardeners immediately lay flat on their faces on the ground. Alice looked around, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs. Their bodies were flat and rectangular, with hands and feet at the corners, similar to the gardeners. Following them were 10 courtiers, also adorned with diamonds, walking in 2 rows. Next came the royal children, all 10 of them, paired off and hand in hand, skipping joyfully. They were all decorated with hearts. Following the children were the guests, mostly kings and queens. Alice recognized the white rabbit among them, but he was too preoccupied, smiling at everything that was said, to notice her. Trailing behind the guests was the Knave of Hearts, carrying a crown on a crimson velvet cushion. Lastly, in the grandest procession, came the King and Queen of Hearts. Alice considered whether she should lie down like the cards, but she had never heard of such a rule. "If I lay down flat, I wouldn't be able to see anything," she thought. So, she stood still and waited. When the procession came to where she was, they all stopped and stared at her. The Queen demanded sternly, "Who is this?" The Knave of Hearts merely bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot!" shouted the Queen, shaking her head and turning to Alice. "What's your name, child?" "My name is Alice, Your Majesty," Alice said very politely, adding in her thoughts, "After all, they're only a pack of cards. I needn't be afraid of them." "And who are these?" said the Queen, pointing to the 3 gardeners lying around the rose tree, for they were lying on their faces, and the pattern on their backs was the same as the rest of the pack, so she couldn't tell whether they were gardeners, soldiers, courtiers, or 3 of her own children. "How should I know?" said Alice, surprised at her own courage. "It's no business of mine." The Queen turned crimson with fury and, after glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, screamed, "Off with her head! Off!" "Nonsense!" said Alice loudly and decidedly, and the Queen was silent. The King laid his hand upon her arm and said timidly, "Consider, my dear, she is only a child." The Queen turned angrily away from him and said to the knave, "Turn them over." The knave carefully turned over the gardeners with 1 foot. "Get up!" said the Queen in a shrill, loud voice, and the 3 gardeners instantly jumped to their feet and began bowing to the King, the Queen, the royal children, and everybody else. "Leave off that!" screamed the Queen. "You make me giddy." Then, turning to the rose tree, she went on, "What have you been doing here?" "Your Majesty, we were," began 2, trembling. "I see," said the Queen, who had been examining the roses. "Off with their heads," and the procession moved on, 3 of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners, who ran to Alice for protection. "You shan't be beheaded," said Alice, and she put them into a large flower pot that stood near. The 3 soldiers wandered about for a minute or 2, looking for them, and then quietly marched off after the others. "Their heads are gone, if it please your Majesty," the soldiers shouted in reply. "That's right," said the Queen. "Can you play croquet?" The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. "Yes," shouted Alice. "Come on, then," roared the Queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. It's a very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the White Rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Hush! Hush!" said the rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke and then raised himself on tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, "She's under sentence of execution." "What for?" said Alice. "Did you say what a pity?" the rabbit asked. "No, I didn't," said Alice. "I don't think it's at all a pity. I said, what for?" She boxed the Queen's ears, the rabbit began. Alice Alice gave a little scream of laughter. "Oh, hush," the rabbit whispered in a frightened tone. "The Queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late," and the Queen said. "Get to your places," shouted the Queen in a voice of thunder, and people began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or two, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet ground in all her life. It was all ridges and furrows, the croquet balls were live hedgehogs, and the mallets live flamingos, and the soldiers had to double themselves up and stand on their hands and feet to make the arches. The chief difficulty Alice found at first was in managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away comfortably enough under her arm, with its legs hanging down, but generally, just as she had got its neck nicely straightened out and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with its head, it would twist itself round and look up in her face with such a puzzled expression that she could not help bursting out laughing. And when she had got its head down, and was going to begin again, it was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself, and was in the act of crawling away. Besides all this, there was generally a ridge or furrow in the way wherever she wanted to send the hedgehog to, and, as the doubled-up soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground, Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once without waiting for turns, quarreling all the while, and fighting for the hedgehogs, and in a very short time, the Queen was in a furious passion and went stamping about and shouting, "Off with his head," or "Off with her head," about once in a minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy. To be sure, she had not as yet had any dispute with the Queen, but she knew that it might happen at any moment, and then, thought she, what would become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there's anyone left alive. She was looking about for some way of escape and wondering whether she could get away without being seen when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but, after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin, and she said to herself, "It's the Cheshire Cat. Now I shall have somebody to talk to." "How are you getting on?" said the cat, as soon as there was a mouth enough for it to speak with. Alice waited till the eyes appeared and then nodded. "It's no use speaking to it," she thought, "till its ears have come, or at least one of them." In another minute, the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo and began an account of the game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think that there was enough of it now in sight, and no more of it appeared. "I don't think they play at all fairly," Alice began in a rather complaining tone, "and they all quarrel so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak, and they don't seem to have any rules in particular. At least, if there are, nobody attends to them, and you've no idea how confusing it is, all the things being alive. For instance, there's the arch I've got to go through next, walking about at the other end of the ground, and I should have croqueted the Queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming." "How do you like the Queen?" said the cat in a low voice. "Not at all," said Alice. she's so extremely. Just then she noticed that the queen was close behind her, listening, so she went on, likely to win, that it's hardly worthwhile finishing the game. The queen smiled and passed on. "Who are you talking to?" said the king, going up to Alice and looking at the cat's head with great curiosity. "It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire cat," said Alice. "Allow me to introduce it." "I don't like the look of it at all," said the king. "However, it may kiss my hand if it likes." "I'd rather not," the cat remarked. "Don't be impertinent," said the king, "and don't look at me like that." He got behind Alice as he spoke. "A cat may look at a king," said Alice. "I've read that in some book, but I don't remember where." "Well, it must be removed," said the king very decidedly, and he called the queen, who was passing at the moment, "My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed." The queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small. "Off with his head," she said, without even looking around. "I'll fetch the executioner myself," said the king eagerly, and he hurried off. Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going on, as she heard the queen's voice in the distance, screaming with passion. She had already sentenced 3 of the players to be executed for having missed their turns, and she did not like the look of things at all, as the game was in such confusion that she never knew whether it was her turn or not. So she went in search of her hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice an excellent opportunity for croqueting one of them with the other, but, as it was getting itself untwisted and began crawling away, she noticed that one of the arches had wandered off to the other end of the ground, and she could not reach it with her flamingo. She quitted her search, but the flamingo had got itself perched in a tree, and was not to be persuaded to come down again. Alice knew not what to do. Alice looked around and decided it was no longer worth playing the game, so she returned to her friend the Cheshire Cat. She was surprised to find quite a large crowd collected around it. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, the king, and the queen, who were all talking at once, while all the rest were quite silent and looked very uncomfortable. As soon as they saw Alice, they called out to her to settle the question, and they repeated their arguments to her, though, as they all spoke at once, she found it very hard indeed to make out exactly what they said. The executioner argued that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it off from. He had never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin at his time of life. The king argued that anything that had a head could be beheaded, and that you weren't to talk nonsense. The queen's argument was that if something wasn't done about it in less than no time, she'd have everybody executed, all round. It was this last remark that had made the whole party look so grave and anxious. Alice could think of nothing else to say but, "It belongs to the Duchess, you'd better ask her about it." "She's in prison," the queen said to the executioner. "Fetch her here." The executioner went off like an arrow. The cat's head began fading away the moment he was gone, and, By the time he had come back with the Duchess, it had entirely disappeared. So the king and the executioner ran wildly up and down, looking for it, while the rest went back to the game. "I'm so glad we meet again," the Duchess said cheerfully as she took Alice's arm and walked with her. Seeing the Duchess in a good mood, Alice felt very pleased. Remembering the rough encounter in the kitchen, she thought it might have been because of the pepper and said, "If I were the Duchess, though I don't really wish to be, I would never keep pepper in the kitchen. It makes people behave so aggressively. Without pepper, soup would be much better." Alice muttered to herself, feeling as if she had discovered a new rule. Vinegar makes people mean, medicines upset their minds, and candies melt kids' hearts. If people knew this, they wouldn't be so stingy with candy. Lost in these thoughts, Alice forgot about the Duchess until the Duchess's voice startled her. "What are you thinking so deeply about?" "I can't recall a moral just now, but it will come to me soon." "There might not be a moral at all," Alice replied. "If you only look for it, a moral can be found in everything," the Duchess said, pressing closer to Alice. Alice didn't like the Duchess being so close. The Duchess was ugly, and though she was the perfect height to rest her sharp chin on Alice's shoulder, it was very uncomfortable. But Alice didn't want to be rude, so she endured it. "It seems the game is progressing better now," Alice said, trying to continue the conversation. "Yes, and the moral of that is, love. Love is what makes the world go round," said the Duchess. "But some people say it's everyone minding their own business that makes the world go round," Alice whispered. "Ah, that's just it, my dear. Love and minding one's own business," the Duchess said, resting her sharp chin on Alice's shoulder. "She loves finding a moral in everything," Alice thought. "You're probably wondering why I don't put my arm around your waist," the Duchess said after a pause. "It's because I don't know how your flamingo would react. Shall we test it?" "It might peck you," Alice said cautiously. "Quite right. Flamingos and mustard both bite. The moral is birds of a feather flock together," the Duchess said. "But mustard isn't a bird," Alice remarked. "True, you're very clever," the Duchess replied. "I think mustard is a mineral," Alice said. "Indeed it is," said the Duchess, now ready to agree with anything Alice said. "There's a mustard mine around here. The moral is mine, all mine, and what's yours is mine." Alice wasn't listening to the Duchess's moral and exclaimed, "I understand. Mustard is a plant. It doesn't look like one, but it is." "Yes, and the moral is appearances can be deceiving," the Duchess said. "I would understand you better if I saw it written down." "Hearing it isn't enough," Alice said politely. "Oh, I can write it down easily," the Duchess said in a pleasant voice. "It must be hard work." "You don't need to trouble yourself," Alice said. "No trouble at all. I'll gift you all the morals I've mentioned, the Duchess replied. What a strange gift, Alice thought. I'm glad it's not a birthday present. What are you thinking now? The Duchess asked, resting her sharp chin on Alice's other shoulder. I have a right to think, Alice snapped, annoyed. Of course. Pigs have a right to fly. And the moral of that, the Duchess's voice suddenly trailed off, and her arm trembled as she clung to Alice. Alice looked up to see the Queen standing before them, arms crossed, with a stormy expression. How are you, Your Majesty? The Duchess said in a low, trembling voice. The Queen stamped her foot and shouted, If you don't disappear this instant, I'll have your head off. The Duchess vanished in a flash. Now, let's continue the game, the Queen said to Alice. Too frightened to speak, Alice followed the Queen back to the croquet field. The other players, who had been resting in the shade, quickly resumed playing. The Queen insisted that any delay would result in beheading. Throughout the game, the Queen incessantly shouted, Off with his head, or off with her head. The soldiers, busy arresting the condemned players, couldn't act as goalposts. After about half an hour, there were no goalposts left, and all the players except for the King, Queen, and Alice were imprisoned. Finally, the Queen paused and, panting, asked Alice, Have you seen the mock turtle yet? No, I don't even know what a mock turtle is, Alice replied. It's what mock turtle soup is made from, the Queen explained. I've never seen one or heard of one, Alice said. Come with me, and the mock turtle will tell you his story, the Queen said. As they left, Alice heard the King whisper to the prisoners, You are all pardoned. Relieved, Alice thought, Oh, I'm so glad. Soon, the Queen and Alice met a griffin lying fast asleep in the sun. Get up, you lazy thing, the Queen shouted. Take this young lady to the mock turtle and tell him to recount his life story. I must go and oversee some executions. The Queen hurried off, leaving Alice with the griffin. Though she didn't like its looks, Alice decided it was better than following the frightening Queen. The griffin sat up, rubbed its eyes, and chuckled. It muttered to itself or to Alice, Really, this is all so funny. What is so funny? Alice asked. The Queen's antics. It's all imagination. No one ever gets executed. Come along, the Griffin said. Alice followed slowly, thinking, everyone here keeps saying, come along. I've never received so many orders in my life. They soon saw the mock turtle sitting alone on a rock, looking sad and lonely. As they got closer, they heard deep, heart-wrenching sighs. Feeling sorry for the mock turtle, Alice asked the Griffin, why is he so sad? It's all in his imagination. There's nothing to be sad about. Come along. the Griffin replied. They approached the Mock Turtle, who looked at them with large, tear-filled eyes, but said nothing. This young lady wants to hear your story, the Griffin said. Sit down, and don't speak until I've finished, the Mock Turtle said in a low voice. Alice and the Griffin sat down, and a long silence followed. Alice wondered when the story would start and waited patiently. Finally, the Mock Turtle sighed deeply and began, Once, I was a real turtle. There was a pause filled only with the Griffin's occasional exclamation and the Mock Turtle's sobs. Alice wanted to get up and thank him for the story, but she felt there was more to come, so she remained silent. When I was young, I went to school in the sea. Our teacher was an old turtle, whom we called Tortoise. The Mock Turtle began again, more calmly. Why did you call him Tortoise if he wasn't one? Alice asked. Because he taught us, the Mock Turtle replied angrily. You really are very dull. The Griffin added, That's a silly question. Alice felt deeply embarrassed and tried to change the subject. Please go on. We went to school in the sea. The best education you can imagine. Every day, the Mock Turtle said. I've been to school too, though not in the sea, Alice remarked. Did you have extra lessons? The Mock Turtle asked. Yes, French and music, Alice replied. Ah. But did you learn washing? The Mock Turtle inquired. Certainly not. Alice exclaimed indignantly. Then it wasn't a really good school, the Mock Turtle said in relief. In our school, French, music, and washing were all optional. You wouldn't need to wash in the sea, Alice pointed out. I didn't take extra lessons. I only learned regular courses, the Mock Turtle sighed. What were they? Alice asked. Reeling and writhing, of course, to begin with. Then the different branches of arithmetic, ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision, the Mock Turtle replied. I've never heard of uglification. What is it? Alice asked, summoning her courage. Never heard of uglification. You know beautification, surely? The Griffin exclaimed. Yes, it means making something prettier, Alice answered, unsure. Well then, if you don't know uglification, you are very simple, the Griffin said. Alice didn't want to ask any more questions, so she said, What else did you learn? We also learned drawing, stretching, and fainting in coils, the Mock Turtle continued. Our teacher was an old eel, who came once a week. How did you manage that? Alice asked. I can't show you. I'm too stiff now, and the Griffin never learned it, the Mock Turtle replied. I didn't have time. I took classical courses from an old crab, the Griffin added. I never took lessons from the crab. He taught laughing in grief, the Mock Turtle sighed. Yes, he did, the Griffin agreed, sighing deeply and hiding his face in his claws. How many hours a day did you have lessons? Alice asked hurriedly to change the subject. 10 hours the first day, 9 the next, and so on, the Mock Turtle replied. That's a strange timetable, Alice remarked. That's why they call it a lesson, because it lessens. From day to day, the Griffin explained. Alice was puzzled and thought for a moment before saying, then, on the 11th day, there would be no lessons? Precisely, the Mock Turtle replied. What happened on the 12th day? Alice asked seriously. Enough of lessons. Tell her about the games, the Griffin interrupted firmly. The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and covered his eyes with one fin. He seemed to be struggling to speak and let out a small sob before saying, You've never lived in the sea, have you? No, I haven't, Alice replied. Then you've never been introduced to a lobster? Alice almost said she'd eaten one, but quickly corrected herself. No, never. Then you can't possibly know how delightful the lobster quadrille is. What kind of dance is it? Alice asked, curious. The Griffin answered, it's a dance where you form a long line along the shore. 2 lines. The Mock Turtle interrupted. You line up with seals, turtles, and salmon. First, you have to clear the jellyfish out of the way. That takes some time, the Griffin added. You take 2 steps forward and pair up with a lobster, the Griffin shouted. Exactly. 2 steps forward, pair up, the Mock Turtle said. Then you throw the lobster as far as you can, the Griffin continued. After that, you swim after the lobster, doing somersaults, the Mock Turtle said, getting excited. Then you change lobsters again, the Griffin shouted. And return to the shore, where the first figure ends, the Mock Turtle finished, his voice dropping suddenly. The Mock Turtle and Griffin, who had been excitedly explaining the dance, suddenly looked sad as they stared at Alice. It sounds like a lovely dance, Alice said softly. Would you like to see it? The Mock Turtle asked. Yes, very much, Alice replied eagerly. Griffin, let's show her. We can do it without lobsters. Who will sing? You sing, the Griffin said. I've forgotten the words. The Mock Turtle and Griffin began dancing around Alice, sometimes stepping on her feet and waving their front paws in the air. The Mock Turtle sang a slow, sad song. Will you walk a little faster? Said a whiting to a snail. There's a porpoise close behind us, and he's treading on my tail. See how eagerly the lobsters and the turtles all advance. They are waiting on the shingle. Will you come and join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance? You can really have no notion how delightful it will be when they take us up and throw us, with the lobsters, out to sea. But the snail replied, too far, and gave a look askance. Said he thanked the whiting kindly, but he would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not, would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not join the dance. What matters it how far we go? His scaly friend replied, there is another shore, you know, upon the other side. The further off from England the nearer is to France. Then turn not pale, beloved snail, but come and join the dance. Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance? Thank you, it was a most interesting dance, and the song about the whiting was very pleasant, Alice said when the song ended. You've seen whiting, of course? The Mock Turtle asked. Yes, at dinners, Alice began, but then stopped. I don't know where dinners may be, but you do know what a whiting looks like, the Mock Turtle said. They have their tails in their mouths and are covered in breadcrumbs, Alice said after a moment of thought. Breadcrumbs would wash off in the sea. No, they have their tails in their mouths to keep them from being thrown too far, the Mock Turtle explained. Alice was curious, why are they called whiting? They polish their shoes with whiting, the Griffin said seriously. Alice repeated, puzzled, polish their shoes with whiting? Yes, like you polish your shoes with blacking, the Griffin explained. But why do they call it whiting? Alice asked. They use soles and eels, and they polish them until they shine white. Even shrimps can understand that, the Griffin said. If I were a whiting, I'd say to the porpoise, stop treading on my tail. Alice said. Whiting always have to go with the porpoises. It's their purpose, the Mock Turtle said. Alice asked, do you mean purpose? I said purpose, and that's what I meant, the Mock Turtle replied grumpily. Then the Griffin said to Alice, tell us about your adventures. Alice hesitated but started, well, this morning I saw a rabbit, and then stopped, unsure if she should continue. The Mock Turtle interrupted, explain what you mean by that. No time for explanations, the Griffin said impatiently. Let's hear about your adventures. Alice began telling her strange encounters since seeing the white rabbit, gaining confidence as she spoke. The Mock Turtle and Griffin listened intently until she mentioned reciting Father William in front of the caterpillar. The Mock Turtle sighed and said, that's very curious. It is indeed, the Griffin agreed. The Mock Turtle, deep in thought, said, if you misrecited, you should say it again. Recite the voice of the lazy. Alice felt as if she were back at school, but stood up and began to recite. She was so distracted by thoughts of the lobster quadrille that she mixed up the words. It is the voice of the lobster. I heard him declare, you have baked me too brown. I must sugar my hair, as a duck with its eyelids. So he with his nose trims his belt and his buttons, and turns out his toes. When the sands are all dry, he is gay as a lark, and will talk in contemptuous tones of the shark. But when the tide rises, and sharks are around, his voice has a timid and tremulous sound. That's not the way I remember it, said the Griffin. The Mock Turtle added, it's the strangest nonsense I've ever heard. Alice didn't reply, worried she wouldn't remember the next verse. I want to hear an explanation, the Mock Turtle demanded. I don't think I can explain, Alice began, but the Griffin interrupted, no time. Let's hear the next verse. How does a lobster turn its nose to trim its toes? The Mock Turtle asked insistently. That's part of the first figure of the dance, Alice explained, hoping to move on to another topic. The Griffin urged, recite the next verse. It begins, I passed by his garden. Alice, sure she would get it wrong, started shakily. I passed by his garden, and marked, with one eye, how the owl and the panther were sharing a pie. The panther took pie crust and gravy and meat, while the owl had the dish as its share of the treat. When the pie was all finished, the owl, as a boon, was kindly permitted to pocket the spoon, while the panther received knife and fork with a growl, and concluded the banquet by The Mock Turtle interrupted, if you can't explain what you recite, it's useless to repeat such nonsense. Perhaps it's best to stop, the Griffin agreed, much to Alice's relief. Would you like to see another figure of the lobster quadrille, or shall we have the Mock Turtle sing a song? The Griffin asked. Alice quickly said, oh, a song, please. A song from the Mock Turtle. The Griffin looked a bit offended but agreed, very well. Friend, sing Turtle Soup. The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and, in a choking voice, sang. Beautiful soup, so rich and green, waiting in a hot tureen. Who for such dainties would not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Bow, bootiful soup. Bow, bootiful soup. Soup of the evening. Beautiful, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup. Who cares for fish, game, or any other dish? Who would not give all else for two? Pennyworth only of beautiful soup? Pennyworth only of beautiful soup? Bow, bootiful soup. Bow, bootiful soup. Soup of the evening. Beautiful, beauty, full soup. Sing it again. the griffin cried. The mock turtle was about to start again when a voice in the distance called out, "The trial's beginning. Come on!" The griffin shouted, grabbing Alice's hand and running. "But what trial is it?" Alice panted. "Come on," was all the griffin answered as they ran faster. Alice heard the mock turtle's sad song fade away. Soup of the evening. Beautiful, beautiful soup. When Alice and the griffin arrived, the king and queen were seated on their thrones, surrounded by a large crowd of birds, beasts, and cards. At the forefront stood the Knave of Hearts, chained and guarded by soldiers. The White Rabbit stood beside the king, holding a trumpet in one hand and a scroll of parchment in the other. In the center of the court was a table with a large plate of tarts. The sight of the delicious tarts made Alice hungry, and she wished the trial would end soon so she could eat one. However, knowing that was unlikely, she looked around the courtroom to pass the time. Alice had never been to a trial before but had read about them in books, so she was fascinated by the courtroom terms and muttered to herself, "The person in the large wig must be the judge." However, the judge was the king, who wore a crown over his wig, which looked very uncomfortable and unfitting. "That's the jury box, and those 12 creatures must be the jurors," Alice thought, feeling pleased with herself for knowing such terms, which most girls her age wouldn't know. But she wished she had used the term jurors instead of creatures. The 12 jurors were busily writing on slates. "What are they doing?" Alice whispered to the griffin. "They haven't started the trial yet. They're writing down their names in case they forget them before the trial ends," the griffin whispered back. "What silly things they are," Alice said loudly. Silence in the court. The White Rabbit cried out, and Alice quickly closed her mouth. The king put on his spectacles and peered around to see who was talking. Alice noticed the jurors writing silly things on their slates and even saw one juror asking his neighbor how to spell silly. The slates will be a mess before the trial is over, Alice thought. One of the jurors, a lizard named Bill, was scribbling so loudly that Alice couldn't stand it. She went around the back of the court and took his pencil away. Bill, being a small and timid creature, didn't know what had happened and spent the rest of the trial looking for his pencil. He had to write with his finger, which didn't work on the slate. "Harold, read the accusation," the king ordered. The White Rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet, then unrolled the parchment and read. "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts. All on a summer day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts and took them quite away. Consider your verdict," the king said to the jury. "Not yet, not yet," the rabbit hastily interrupted. "There's a great deal to come before that." "Call the first witness," said the king. The White Rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet and called out, "First witness." The first witness was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand and a piece of buttered bread in the other. "Please, Your Majesty," he began, "I'm bringing these in because I wasn't done with my tea when I was summoned." "You ought to have finished your tea," said the king. "When did you begin?" The Hatter looked at the March Hare, who had followed him into the court, arm in arm with the Dormouse. "I think it was the 14th of March, the Hare said. 15th, said the Dormouse. 16th, said the March Hare. "Write that down," the king said to the jury, who busily wrote the 3 dates on their slates and then added them up and converted them into money. "Take off your hat," the king said to the Hatter. "It isn't mine," the Hatter replied. "Stolen!" the king exclaimed, turning to the jury, who instantly wrote this down. "I keep them to sell," the Hatter explained. "I have none of my own. I'm a Hatter." The queen put on her spectacles and stared hard at the Hatter, who turned pale and fidgeted nervously. "Give your evidence," said the king, "or I'll have you executed." This terrified the Hatter so much that he dropped his teacup and bread and began shaking uncontrollably. Alice felt curious, because something seemed strange until she realized she was growing again. At first, she thought of leaving the courtroom, but she decided to stay as long as she could. "Don't push me," said the Dormouse, who was next to her. "I can hardly breathe." "I can't help it," Alice said. "I'm growing." "You've no right to grow here," said the Dormouse. "Don't talk nonsense," Alice replied. "You're growing too." "Yes, but I grow at a reasonable rate," said the Dormouse. The queen, who was staring at the Hatter, turned to the soldier and ordered, "Bring the list of the singers at the last concert." The poor Hatter trembled so much that he nearly lost both his shoes. "Give your evidence," the king repeated, "or I'll have you executed." "I'm a poor man, Your Majesty," the Hatter began, "and I had just begun my tea. I cut some bread and butter." "What did the Dormouse say?" One of the jurors interrupted. "That I can't remember," said the Hatter. "You must remember," said the king, "or I'll have you executed." The Hatter dropped to his knees, trembling, and pleaded, "I'm a poor man, Your Majesty." "You're a very poor speaker," said the king. One of the guinea pigs cheered, and the officers of the court immediately suppressed it. "This involves tying its mouth shut, putting its head down into a bag, and sitting on it." Alice thought to herself, "I've read about such things in the newspapers." At the end of trials, there was some attempt at applause, which was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. "I never understood what it meant until now." "If that's all you know, you may stand down," said the king. "I can't go any lower," said the Hatter. "I'm already on the floor." "Then you may sit down," the king said. Another guinea pig cheered and was suppressed. Now then, call the next witness, said the king. The next witness was the Duchess's cook. She carried a pepper pot in her hand, and Alice guessed who it was before she entered the court because everyone started sneezing. Give your evidence, said the king. Shan't, said the cook. The king looked at the White Rabbit, who said in a low voice, Your Majesty must cross-examine this witness. Well, if I must, I must, the king said with a forlorn look. He crossed his arms, frowned, and asked, What are tarts made of? Pepper, mostly, said the cook. Treacle, said a sleepy voice behind her. Collar that dormouse. The queen shrieked. Behead that dormouse. Turn that dormouse out of court. Suppress him. Pinch him. Off with his whiskers. For some minutes, the courtroom was in chaos as the dormouse was chased out. When things settled down, the cook had disappeared. Never mind, said the king with relief. Call the next witness. Alice watched the White Rabbit as he fumbled through the list. Alice felt a mix of curiosity and excitement, wondering who the next witness would be. For they haven't got much evidence yet, she said to herself. Imagine Alice's surprise when the White Rabbit called out, Alice. Alice responded in a surprised voice, Here I am. In her flustered state, she forgot how much she had grown in the last few minutes and hastily stood up, overturning the jury box. The jurors tumbled head over heels onto the audience below. The sight of this reminded Alice of when she had accidentally knocked over a goldfish bowl a week before. Oh dear, I'm sorry. Alice exclaimed loudly, and she quickly began putting the jurors back in their places. The goldfish incident kept coming to mind, making her think she had to get the jurors back quickly or something terrible might happen. We cannot proceed until all the jurors are back in their places, the king said sternly, glaring at Alice. As Alice looked at the jury box, she realized she had accidentally placed a lizard upside down. The poor lizard's tail was sticking up in the air, so Alice quickly righted him and muttered, Whether they sit upside down or right side up, it doesn't matter for the trial. The jurors returned to their senses and began busily writing on their slates again. However, the lizard remained dazed, staring up at the ceiling with his mouth open. The king asked Alice, What do you know about this affair? Nothing, Alice replied. Nothing at all? The king pressed. Nothing at all, Alice confirmed. The king looked at the jurors and said, This is very important. The jurors tried to write this down, but the White Rabbit interrupted, Your Majesty means, of course, that it's not important. The rabbit looked anxiously at the king, who quickly corrected himself, Oh, yes, of course, unimportant, I meant to say. The king muttered to himself, Important, unimportant, important, unimportant. Some jurors wrote important, and others wrote unimportant. Alice, who could see their slates, thought, I don't see the point in writing this down. The king, who had been scribbling in his notebook, called out, Silence. Rule 42, all persons more than a mile high must leave the court. Everyone looked at Alice. I'm not a mile high, Alice protested. You are, said the queen. Nearly 2 miles. Well, I won't go. That's a rule you just made up. Alice retorted. It's the oldest rule in the book, the king insisted. Then it should be number 1, Alice argued. The king turned pale and shut his notebook hurriedly. Consider your verdict, he said to the jury in a low voice. The White Rabbit jumped up. Your Majesty, there is still more evidence. I found this paper just now. What's written on it? The Queen asked. I haven't opened it yet, but it seems to be a letter written by the prisoner, the White Rabbit replied. To whom is it addressed? Asked one of the jurors. It isn't addressed to anyone, the rabbit said, and there's nothing written on the outside. The rabbit unrolled the parchment and continued, It's not a letter after all, it's a set of verses. Are they in the prisoner's handwriting? Another juror asked. No, they aren't, the rabbit answered, and that is the strangest thing about it. The jury looked puzzled. Someone must have imitated his handwriting, said the king. The jurors brightened up. The Knave of Hearts spoke, Your Majesty, I didn't write it, and there's no name signed at the end. If you didn't sign it, that only makes matters worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you'd have signed your name like an honest man. The king declared, drawing a round of applause from the court, for it was the first wise thing he had said that day. That proves his guilt, said the queen. It proves nothing of the sort, Alice said. You don't even know what the verses are about. Read them, the king commanded. The White Rabbit put on his spectacles and began reading. They told me you had been to her and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent them word I had not gone. We know it to be true. If she should push the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her 1, they gave him 2. You gave us 3 or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free, exactly as we were. My notion was that you had been, before she had this fit, an obstacle that came between him and ourselves and it. Don't let him know she liked them best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest, between yourself and me. "That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet," said the king, rubbing his hands. "So now let the jury—" "If any one of them can explain it," said Alice, who had grown so large she wasn't afraid to interrupt, "I'll give him 6 pence. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in it." The jury wrote this down. "But there's no meaning to it," the king said, "so we don't need to try to find any. And yet, I seem to see some meaning in it, after all. I could not swim, you can't swim, can you?" he added, turning to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly. "Do I look like it?" He was made entirely of cardboard. "All right, so far," said the king, looking at the poem again. "We know it to be true, that's the jury, of course. If she should push the matter on, that must be the queen. I gave her 1, they gave him 2, why, that's about the tarts, you know." "Yes, but they were mine before," Alice pointed out. "Well, of course, they were mine before," the king said, "but now they're mine again. And the 1 and 2 and 3 make sense, don't they?" The queen said, "He must have stolen them." Alice said, "You can't prove anything by that nonsense." "If there's no meaning in it," said the king, "that saves a world of trouble, you know, as we needn't try to find any. But yet, I think there's some meaning in it, after all." The king looked over the verses with one eye while holding the other shut. "I gave her 1, they gave him 2. Why, that must be what he did with the tarts, you know. But it was all her fancy, that. Who was the she?" said the king. "I should have thought it obvious," the queen said irritably, throwing an inkstand at Bill, the lizard. Bill had been trying to write with 1 finger and had smeared himself with ink in the process. "If it wasn't for that," the king said, "we must find the verdict, guilty or not guilty." "But we haven't heard the half of it yet," the queen screamed. "Off with her head. Off. Who cares for you?" said Alice. She had grown to her full size by this time. "You're nothing but a pack of cards." At this, the whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down upon her. Alice gave a little scream and tried to beat them off, finding herself lying on her sister's lap on the bank. Alice's sister was brushing away some leaves that had fallen from the trees onto her face. "Wake up, Alice dear," said her sister. "Why, what a long sleep you've had." "Oh, I've had such a curious dream," said Alice, and she told her sister all about the strange adventures. Her sister kissed her and said, "It was a curious dream, dear, but now it's time for tea. Run along." Alice got up and ran off, thinking as she ran, what a wonderful dream it had been. But her sister stayed on the bank, leaning her head on her hand, watching the sun set and thinking about little Alice and her wonderful adventures. She imagined herself falling into Alice's dream and began dreaming herself, with her little hands clasped upon her knee and her head bent down. She could see Alice's bright eager eyes, the sounds of the strange creatures in her dream echoing in her ears. The rustling of the leaves in the wind, the rippling of the waves on the pond, the tinkling of the sheep bells, and the distant voices of shepherd boys all seemed to be part of Alice's strange adventures. At last, she thought about how her little sister Alice would grow up and still keep the simple and loving heart of her childhood. She would gather children around her and tell them the strange stories, making their eyes shine with wonder and delight. Alice would share in their joys and sorrows, remembering her own happy childhood and the golden summer days.